Hello and welcome to this conversation we are having at ORF on India's China conundrum. Actually, it has now become a global conundrum. Uh, China is not only being aggressive towards India on the line of actual control in East Ladakh, it is on a territory claiming spree, whether it is Nepal, whether it's Bhutan, whether it's Japan, whether it's the South China Sea. There is, of course, Taiwan and a strange story has now come up that St. Petersburg actually belongs to China. So it's a strange aggression that is emerging, and the world is also now beginning to react, and there is a pushback happening by way of rejecting China tech, and more specifically 5G vis-a-vis Huawei. Now, India, of course, has virtually shut its doors to Huawei. We have prohibited and proscribed Chinese apps. Uh, Country after country in Europe is now waking up to the reality of China and its technology, and they are rejecting Huawei. America, of course, has firmly shut its doors. Uh, Canada remains a gray zone. And I have with me two very interesting participants. My colleague Trisha at ORF, who deals with technology, policy, and geopolitics. And I have Shuvaloy Majumdar in Canada. He's the program director and Monk Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's the former foreign policy advisor to the Foreign Minister of Canada. Welcome, both of you. Shuvala, let's begin with you. Uh, Chinese technology has posed a huge problem for Canada. And Canada now faces what you once described as Canada's 5G conundrum. Where does Canada stand now on this issue?
Alone, sadly, Kanchan. I would have to say that Canada has been deeply indecisive about the future of how China's presence in its 5G infrastructure will stand. In Canada, we have something called the Investment Canada Act. And what that act serves is that for any investments that are coming from around the world to both public and private sectors, there are always security considerations that are imposed upon it. Obviously, China is principally under scrutiny and Chinese investment is principally under scrutiny. And so this decision has been around Huawei accessing and building Canada's 5G infrastructure has been sitting before this government for years. There's no real reason for why the Canadian cabinet could not pronounce today on where its position is on China. And when you look at it from the perspective of Ottawa, we are part of the Five Eyes Alliance. It is with the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. It is a really important multilateral vehicle for shared security interests. And we are the only outlier in having made a decision around the presence of Huawei and 5G in Canada's infrastructure. So sadly, to this date, Canada has not been decisive in how it would treat the presence of Chinese technology in this critical infrastructure.
But what explains this reluctance? I mean, you can't. I mean, there's no halfway house on this issue.
It's a mystery in terms of why, and it's a mystery to many members of Canadian civil society and analysts as to why it's been such a prolonged decision. Some speculation on this could be that it is involved with the affair involving Madame Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, who is presently detained in Vancouver, awaiting an extradition request by the United States to be tried in a New York court. The United States extradition request goes to the charges around fraud that Huawei would have allegedly conducted. And the fraud specifically pertains to moving hundreds of millions of dollars from Huawei through their front companies in Syria, companies like Skycom, into Iran against Iran sanctions and Iran regulations. And that extradition request has created great tension between Canada and the United States on one side and China on the other, and has become a real political football. And because Madam Meng is the 5G's chief financial officer, maybe the speculation is that a decision point around 5G and Huawei would be a card that the Canadian government could play. If that was indeed the case, it would be one of the most irresponsible acts that the government of Canada could have made.
Trisha, we heard about Canada's 5G conundrum. In a sense, India is also facing a 5G conundrum. We have virtually shut our doors on Huawei, but we haven't officially declared that Huawei is not welcome or that we are not going to do business with Huawei. How do you explain the reluctance on part of India to take a firm, clear position on this, as firm as the decision to prohibit and proscribe Chinese apps?
I think within most Indian policymakers' minds, the threat of Huawei is pretty clear. However, I mean, not every country has chosen to be as strong in their statements against Huawei as, say, the US or Poland, for that matter. And in India, it's a reflection of, one, the fact that we are still, our economic interests are still strongly interlinked with China. And for us to really take a strong stance, it needs a kind of comprehensive evaluation of all these interlinkages and like a security evaluation of all of them. And that hopefully is forthcoming, but none at the moment. The other factor would, I think, be differences within the government as well on the most appropriate way of countering China. There is a camp, of course, that says that you can de-link the economic component of our relationship with China from the security component, and others who do not think that is the case at all. And so the hesitation, I think, also reflects some of that internal conundrum as well. So I think the closest
Trisha, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but on some issues, the government has been very forthcoming, it has been very forthright, and it has been very firm. For instance, on Chinese investment in strategic sector, any strategic sector, whether it's banking, industry, or whatever, they have said that any investment coming from China or Chinese front companies cannot go through the automatic route. It will have to go through scrutiny. Then yesterday, a notification was issued by the government that Government of India and state governments will not be procuring any material from any Chinese source. I mean, they did not mention China. They said countries which share a border with India, but it is very obvious that the target is China. Third, we have decided to cancel all kinds of tenders for highways, for component supplies for railways, because Chinese firms had bid for those tenders, and we don't want to give those tenders to them anymore. Then the third component, as I said, was that we very clearly, unambiguously cited security reasons for banning Chinese apps. Now, if we can be so firm, we can be so clear on these issues and be so upfront about them, what stops us from being upfront about Huawei? Because there is appreciation in government that Chinese tech is not in India's national interest.
Again, so even with this, the examples you cited, most of these measures were shrouded in the countries with land borders language. That was the case with the automatic route investment portion as well. And again, I think the hesitation in putting that strong language into a internal conundrum to an extent. But again, in effect, yes, we are still at least working towards rooting Huawei out of our networks, even if it is in not as explicit or strong terms. So we've had MTNL and BSNL being barred from using Chinese equipment. And I believe there's going to be a notification to private telecom companies as well, many of which already do have contracts with Huawei. And there is a move there, but because of the complication of the actual process of decoupling from China, I think it is reasonable to move with some caution. In the app case, it's not a major, it won't leave a major dent on the Indian economy if we ban a handful of apps. It hasn't really affected us the way, say, a wholesale ban of other kinds of investment and moves into the Indian technology sector would have. So the app ban, and many have said that it's probably more symbolic really than substantive. It's definitely a good symbolic move because it has encouraged other countries, because a lot of countries look to what India is doing, and the app ban has encouraged us also more deeply look at like TikTok's very questionable data practices and so on. So that there's an effect there, but moving with caution is advisable at this point.
Shuvaloy, coming back to the global approach towards China, there has been some talk of building a great wall of democracy to confront, contain, and also somehow restrain China from its expansionist outlook, from its expansionist misadventures. But one of the cement or one of the components to build this great wall of democracy could be when if democracies were to get together on technology. But for that, the West has to be more sharing with its technology with the developing world. The West has to be more giving to those countries which are trying to sort of measure up to technology requirements of the day. And the West has to lead the way. That somehow doesn't seem to be happening. The West is still very uptight about sharing technology, about providing technology. What do you think about this?
Well, it's a huge question because you're describing the future infrastructure of economic growth in the world that we're attempting to do during a period of, I think Trisha used the word properly right at the outset, of decoupling. In a period of decoupling that has been initiated as a direct consequence of Chinese decisions. And of course, we're in the midst of a global pandemic in which all the supply chains of the world are somewhat retracted in this period. We're experiencing great global retraction. Over a quarter, 250 million people are expected to be unemployed in the immediate outset. So we're talking about a very big question of the order of international technology in the midst of great global disruption. I would say that there are very powerful questions for the democratic model to decide upon when it comes to the governance of data and technology. And Western countries have been, in one part, there's inertia around their positions with respect to China to consider the People's Republic as a partner versus a rival. That has not yet been entirely resolved in the West, although you are starting to see movement, as has been mentioned in Poland and elsewhere in the UK, in that general direction. But that has not been a consensus in the West as of yet. You have the emergence of growing economies in the Indo-Pacific principally, with India featuring as amongst the most important in how it has improved its own economic position in the last 5 to 7 years. It's gone from the worst of doing business in the world to being the half worst. Its trajectory is upwards, but the strength of Indian regulation and Indian law is getting to a point in which there can be reliability around the questions of data governance. There are powerful questions, I think, that democracies have to reflect upon in this decoupling. Powerful questions around the protection of civil rights, the domain of large corporations, and of state-sponsored threats in cybersecurity and information operations. These three poles, I think, are deciding how are the tensions within how democracies have to reflect on building policy around the free flow of data, as well as being able to advantage the opportunities that data affords in their own development, economic development. Set in that context, there are some very encouraging early steps that the pandemic has spurred. We are seeing a robust discussion around a digital 10 that was initially proposed by the United Kingdom on how can democracies cooperate in this space. We're seeing housed at the OECD a great repository on clear metrics around economic growth and development, around how the technical nature of data governance can be shared across various borders that both respect the data sovereignty of democracies and create the basis for how the rules for economic growth around technology and data can be initiated. Meanwhile, in the authoritarian model, what we're seeing coming principally from Beijing are steps like the 25-year deal that they made with Iran just in the last weeks. They have obviously looked to advantage themselves in the Indian near neighborhood through Belt and Road infrastructure projects. They have looked at how their telecommunications companies, Huawei being among them, can conduct data mining operations across the emerging world in Africa and Southeast Asia. The authoritarian model is being proposed to these kinds of governments with the proposition that the data that's being harvested will be shared with state security apparatus for the better and more effective, efficient control of their people, in which we're seeing in China now is one of the most advanced models for how AI and data are used to control people and control thought. And so in this world where you see the authoritarian model with Beijing at the center of it, and a democratic model in which states that are emerging economies and established economies are thinking about very complex public policy questions, we're in the midst of that decoupling. And the definitions we apply together in this, both as Eastern democracies and Western democracies, are going to be absolutely crucial for what the next 50 years of global affairs looks like.
So, Trisha, what Shuvaloy talked about, two takeaways from what he said. One was about this idea of creating a big tent for data and data governance. And the second is to figure out or to work out a global principles-based system of data governance which upholds the idea of data sovereignty, something on which India has been very vocal about. How do we carry this forward? Both the ideas.
Yes, so one thing I've seen is that in the initial phrasing or in the initial proposition of the term data sovereignty, there was a lot of pushback because in many policy circles, it was seen as an endorsement of the so-called China model, which is to create a closed system. Whereas the Indian conception of sovereignty, data sovereignty, or cyber sovereignty is more about the application or the applicability of Indian laws and protections over Indian citizens' data. It's not necessarily this closed off model that a lot of countries were fearing India was advocating for. And so especially I see in the EU, there's a greater acceptance of this term, of the assertion of state rights and individual rights in this data space. So we are moving towards, I think, a better understanding of this framework. And I think the biggest pushback at the moment is coming still from the United States, because the notion of data sovereignty, the assertion of individual states' control over data, it challenges the US's dominance of the data economy at present, because much of the big data giants like Google or Facebook are based in the United States. I hope that by the process of dialogue that they do come to understand that the conception of data sovereignty is not about closing off, but rather about individual states having more control vis-a-vis these large corporations. It's not India versus US, it's us seizing back control from these big technology giants.
So can and should India lead the way in at least trying to create some sort of a global framework on data governance, as well as acceptance of data sovereignty?
Certainly, there is a role for India there, and we've seen a lot of data protection regulations coming up, which in a way mirror a lot of the provisions that the PDP has put forth, or revisions that mirror those. It's not just India that is moving towards greater sovereign control over data. We have much of ASEAN moving towards that as well. You have the entire ASEAN framework, which is explicitly about data protection and stronger privacy rights for ASEAN citizens. So there's a movement there, and India certainly is at the helm of that.
Shuvaloy, a last question to you. Technology now also comes wrapped with human rights. I'm not going into the privacy aspects which has been talked about and which people are still talking about. And I mentioned this in the context of China, which has effectively used technology to deny basic inseparable rights to its own citizens and to more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims whom China dominates, and dominates so cruelly. And this aspect of technology and Chinese abuse of technology is now also being exported to China's client states in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East particularly. Some thoughts, I mean, and how does the democratic world, how do democracies respond, or should they at all respond?
One of the great benefits of the world in which we're in now, Kanchan, is that, in my view, it has been the democratic capitalist model that has created these technological advents. While there are problems and questions in policy areas that we've never really had opportunity to pronounce upon until the technologies have been created, they have been principally created within democracies because of the spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship that the democratic capitalist model affords. So thank God that the major data companies are housed under rule of law jurisdictions. It was rule of law jurisdictions that allowed them to be initiated in the first place. The notion of competition, the protections around IP, the capacity to invest in long-term research with confidence, knowing that some state intervention would not subvert the strength of those technologies and those innovations. The fact that they can be scaled to other democracies has been encouraging. It's been part of the globalization story, which is now coming to an update, in which we think of globalization not as a free-for-all across borders, but about how democratic states, nation states, cooperate with each other in the realm of data governance. And so I think that's been all very good. The China model has been to steal IP, to outright raid innovation, and to adopt and apply that innovation toward the Communist Party's own objectives, which is to retain power and retain rule for life for President Xi Jinping. And what we see in China, and how they're completely committing religious and cultural genocide against the Uyghur Muslims, is one horrific example of how China's Communist Party abuses said state rights over data. We're about to see something similar happen in Hong Kong. It has been happening for 5 years since the umbrella movement was birthed through very controlled steps in a longer narrative, and now has been and has now resulted in the end of the concept of basic law and rights over for the people of Hong Kong. And it is the contract that China brings to authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes in Africa and across Asia by saying, listen, we will bring you data infrastructure. We have an interest in collecting that data infrastructure. You have an interest in using our technological adaptation in terms of controlling your own people. It's a half hegemonic model because the Chinese are not looking to administer the states directly, but are looking for proxies through which they can administer these states and derive what resource and data benefits they wish in the short term to fuel the rise of China. So to your bigger question, I think what it requires is a very lucid understanding of what the Chinese value proposition is, and a very long-term view for what the democratic proposition is. And as models of development, I generally have more optimism and faith that the democratic capitalist model has more resilience. It has more ability to adapt to new and defining pressures. And I think that the spirit of cooperation we're seeing, particularly coming from India in this period, is path-breaking and pioneering and extremely relevant and important. In so many ways, the decisions that the Indian state makes with respect to the questions of data sovereignty, the transparency around it, the example of how it will deal with the threats, not just in its near neighborhood, but to its critical alliances and partnerships in the world, will be defining issues, not just at the G20, but hopefully one day at the restored G8 and in other realms of governance in this space.
Thank you. Thank you, Shuvaloy. Thank you, Trisha. And it was a great conversation we had. We can keep on talking. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. And thank you for joining us for this extended conversation on India's China conundrum.